Less than 2 hours before a 50% tariff was set to hit $20 billion of Canadian goods, Donald Trump posted a message on social media that changed everything. He said the tariffs were paused for 3 days because the United States and Canada, in his words, subject to the finalization of documents, have a deal. That happened late Tuesday night, hours ago as this goes live. And here's the detail almost nobody is connecting yet. The exact legal weapon Trump reached for to threaten Canada in the first place, a 96-year-old tariff law built entirely around the idea of punishing a country for retaliating against you, is the same doctrine Canada had already been using against the United States for years. Canada did not just survive this deadline. Canada beat Washington at its own game, using the very same playbook, and forced the President of the United States to blink first. This is not a simple story about a tariff deadline getting extended. This is a story about two countries pointing an identical weapon at each other, and the one that built its version first is the one still standing. Stick with this, because the last 72 hours completely reshape how you should think about this entire trade relationship. This deal is still not fully signed. Hit subscribe if you want to actually follow where this goes over the next few days, because what Trump called a done deal, Canada's own Prime Minister is calling something considerably more cautious. Now let's go back to where this genuinely begins, because the roots of this fight run back further than most coverage lets on. On July 20th, 2026, President Trump signed 3 separate presidential proclamations. Each one invoked Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, a provision so old and so rarely touched that legal scholars had to go digging through archives just to find the last time it was referenced in any official government proceeding. That reference dates back to 1949. Not once, in the 96 years since, has a sitting American president used Section 338 to actually impose a tariff. Not through Korea, not through Vietnam, not through the Cold War, not through the financial crisis, not even during Trump's own first term in office. It sat there, dormant, buried inside the same legislative package as the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, one of the most infamous pieces of economic policy in American history until this past July, when the administration reached back nearly a century to dust it off. Here's what makes Section 338 different from every other tariff tool in the modern American arsenal, and it is the single most important detail in this entire story. It does not require a formal investigation. It does not require a national security finding. It requires the president to determine, essentially by his own judgment, that a foreign country is discriminating against American commerce, and then he can act by proclamation alone. No waiting on the United States Trade Representative, no congressional approval, nothing beyond a minimum 30-day notice period before the tariffs take effect. Section 301 of the Trade Act requires months of formal investigation. Section 232 requires an official national security determination. Section 338 requires none of that. It is, by design, the bluntest, fastest, least accountable tariff weapon sitting anywhere in American trade law, and it was chosen specifically because the Supreme Court had just stripped away Trump's previous go-to tool. That earlier tool was the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the broad emergency authority the administration had used to hit dozens of countries with tariffs simultaneously since early 2025. In February 2026, the Supreme Court ruled those tariffs unlawful, and overnight the White House lost the flexible instrument its entire trade strategy had been built around. So the legal teams went searching for a replacement, and what they landed on was this Depression-era relic, chosen for exactly one reason: speed, with almost no procedural friction standing in the way. Now here is where the real story starts, because the justification the White House gave for invoking Section 338 against Canada specifically is the part that reframes this entire conflict. United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer said it almost bluntly in public remarks. Over the past year and a half, only 2 countries chose to retaliate against Trump's original tariffs rather than simply negotiate: China and Canada. Section 338 was not framed as a first strike. It was framed explicitly by Washington's own trade representative as a punishment for retaliation. Read that twice, because it is the entire hinge this story swings on. The United States built a weapon whose entire legal justification is offsetting a foreign country's decision to hit back. And the country it aimed that weapon at is the one country, alongside China, that had already been hitting back for a year. So let's actually walk through what Canada had already done, because this is the part that gets buried under all the noise about hockey sticks and cement. Back in March of 2025, when Trump's original wave of tariffs first landed on Canadian goods, Canada did not sit quietly. Prime Minister Mark Carney's government announced 25% retaliatory tariffs on $30 billion of American goods, effective immediately, with an explicit threat to expand that scope to 155 billion Canadian dollars, somewhere around 106 billion American dollars, if Washington refused to back down. Canadian provinces went further on their own initiative. Liquor boards across the country pulled American alcohol off government store shelves entirely. Ontario alone had been selling nearly $1 billion Canadian of American liquor products a year, and that revenue simply vanished from American producers within weeks. Canadian imports of American alcoholic beverages collapsed by roughly 81% between March 2025 and February 2026, a loss of almost $600 million for American exporters. Canada also placed its own 25% surtax on American-made vehicles, a direct mirror of the Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs Washington had imposed the year before. Canadian motor vehicle exports from the United States fell by roughly 22% over the following year, dropping from $25.9 billion to $20.3 billion. This is the exact doctrine Section 338 claims for itself. Offset a discriminatory or unequal action with a matching or proportional one. Canada did that first, using its own version of the same logic, years before Washington reached back into a 1930 statute to formalize it into law. Every single justification written into the 3 July proclamations, the vehicle dispute, the alcohol dispute, the dairy dispute, traces directly back to something Canada did in direct response to something Washington did first. Washington built a retaliation weapon to retaliate against Canada's retaliation. That is not a typo, and it is worth sitting with for a second, because it tells you everything about how circular this entire escalation cycle has become. This is your first real pause point, and it's worth dropping a comment on because I want to know what you think. If a law is explicitly designed to punish retaliation, and the target already built and used its own retaliation doctrine years earlier, who actually deployed the weapon first? Let me know your take, and go ahead and subscribe if you want the follow-up once the documents on this new deal are actually signed, because right now what we have is a headline, not a finished agreement. Let's get into the mechanics of the July proclamations themselves, because the specifics matter here. Each of the 3 proclamations imposes an additional 50% duty stacked directly on top of whatever tariffs already apply, covering close to $20 billion of Canadian goods annually across 554 separate tariff lines. And crucially, unlike almost every prior tariff action in this dispute, these duties apply regardless of whether the underlying goods qualify for preferential treatment under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. That detail blindsided trade lawyers across both countries. A valid certificate of USMCA origin, the document that was supposed to shield Canadian exporters from exactly this kind of unilateral action, means nothing under Section 338. The named categories, motor vehicles, alcohol, and dairy, only tell part of the story. Buried inside the annexes are wine, cement, plywood, furniture, fishing rods, seeds, clothing, wigs, swimming pools, and, in one of the more symbolically loaded details of this entire dispute, hockey sticks and hockey equipment. Companies that checked their exposure against only the headline categories discovered, some of them only in the past week, that their actual product lines sat buried several layers deep in an annex nobody had warned them about. Combine these new 50% duties with the existing Section 232 tariffs already sitting on Canadian steel, aluminum, and copper, and some covered goods entering the United States, we're facing a cumulative tariff burden exceeding 75%. That is not a manageable cost increase for any business model. It gets passed straight down the chain, and it lands on an American consumer who has nothing to do with any of this legal back and forth over century-old statutes. Here's your second rehook, because this next part is where the standoff actually got resolved, and it happened within the last 24 hours. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc and Canada's chief negotiator Janice Charette spent the entire weekend in Washington. Monday, Prime Minister Carney described the talks with reporters in French as very intense and very delicate, and specifically said this was not the moment to discuss negotiating positions in public. Carney and Trump spoke by phone twice in 2 days, once on Monday and again on Tuesday afternoon. By Tuesday afternoon, Canadian negotiators believed they had landed on a proposal that could break the impasse, and less than 2 hours before the 50% tariffs were set to take effect at 12:01 a.m. Wednesday, Trump posted on social media that he was pausing the tariffs for 3 days, saying the 2 countries, subject to finalizing paperwork, have a deal. Now look closely at the gap between how each side described that same moment, because it tells you almost everything about where the real leverage actually sat. Trump's post was triumphant, framing it as a completed deal, and he threw in an unrelated flourish about the long-dead Keystone XL pipeline possibly being revived as part of the arrangement, without offering any further detail. Carney's official statement, released shortly afterward, struck a noticeably more careful tone. He confirmed the Section 338 tariffs would be delayed until the end of the day on Friday, August 21st, and said in his own words that substantial progress has been made, although there is important work still to be done. He added that Canada remains focused on building a stronger, more independent, and more competitive economy at home regardless of how these talks conclude. Those 2 statements cannot both be describing a fully finished agreement. One side is calling this closed. The other side is calling it a 3-day extension with real work remaining. That gap between declared victory and cautious acknowledgement is not a communication error. It is the clearest signal available right now about which side actually needed this pause more. According to reporting from inside the negotiations, the emerging shape of the deal involves the United States lowering existing tariffs on Canadian autos, steel, aluminum, and forest products, potentially bringing vehicle tariffs down from 25% towards something closer to 15%, in exchange for Canada agreeing to a list of roughly 10 American demands. Those demands reportedly include Canada dropping its remaining retaliatory tariffs on American goods entirely, provincial governments ending their bans on American alcohol sales, the winding down of Buy Canadian procurement policies, and Ottawa accepting Washington's interpretation of how dairy import licenses under the existing tariff rate quota system should be allocated. In exchange, the White House would shelve the Section 338 tariffs on the roughly $20 billion of goods entirely, rather than let them take effect. Notice what that trade actually represents. Washington is not asking Canada to accept new punishment. Washington is asking Canada to dismantle the exact retaliation infrastructure that gave it leverage in the first place, the same infrastructure built directly out of America's own century-old offset doctrine. If Canada agrees to remove those countermeasures as the price of avoiding Section 338, that is Washington explicitly acknowledging that Canada's retaliatory tariffs were substantial enough to be worth negotiating away, rather than something that could simply be steamrolled. You do not trade away tariffs on autos, steel, and lumber to make an opponent drop something meaningless. There's also a complication sitting underneath all of this that has nothing to do with tariffs directly, and it may end up being the hardest part of the deal to finalize. Several of the American demands touch on areas of provincial jurisdiction inside Canada, not just federal policy. Alcohol sales restrictions are controlled by individual provincial liquor boards. Procurement policy varies province by province. That means Carney cannot simply sign a federal agreement and have it take effect uniformly. He has to convince 13 separate provincial and territorial governments to fall in line with commitments his federal government is making on their behalf. At the exact same moment, some of Canada's most politically sensitive industries, dairy chief among them, are lobbying hard against giving up ground on anything at all. Ontario Premier Doug Ford has spent the better part of the past month publicly pushing for a dollar-for-dollar retaliatory response rather than concessions. And a recent Angus Reid poll found 62% of Canadians support some form of continued retaliation, with more than a third wanting a full matching response rather than a negotiated climb down. Carney is not just negotiating with Washington. He is simultaneously negotiating with his own provinces and his own public opinion, and that second negotiation may prove harder to close than the first one. Let's talk about why Washington actually needed this pause, because the honest answer involves numbers that rarely make headlines. The United States Chamber of Commerce issued a public statement just this week, warning that the new tariffs threaten to damage both economies, drive up costs for American families, disrupt critical supply chains, and put at risk an estimated 13 million American jobs tied to trade with Canada and Mexico combined. The Canadian Federation of Independent Business separately warned its members, representing more than 100,000 small businesses, that the new duties could grind their American sales to a halt entirely if implemented, with some businesses already reporting that American buyers were holding off on new orders purely in anticipation of the higher costs. That is, demand destruction happening before a tariff has even taken effect, purely from the uncertainty of the deadline itself. And that uncertainty compounds a fight that has already done real measurable damage on the Canadian side over the past 18 months. Canadian manufacturing overall has fallen roughly 4% year over year. Motor vehicle and parts production dropped more than 7%. Wood products fell close to 10%. Primary steel production dropped over 10%, and aluminum production and processing collapsed by nearly 18%. More than 32,000 Canadian manufacturing jobs have disappeared over the past 12 months, with motor vehicle parts alone accounting for more than 7,000 of those losses. These are not abstract figures sitting in a policy brief. These are workers in Windsor, in Hamilton, in Saskatoon, absorbing the cost of a trade war fought largely through statutes and proclamations they will never read. Here's a piece of context that deserves real attention, because it explains why Washington chose to negotiate rather than simply let the 50% duties land and see what happened. Multiple legal scholars, including experts cited by the National Law Review and by several major law firms tracking this dispute closely, argue that Section 338 was effectively superseded decades ago by the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 and the Trade Act of 1974, both of which created more modern, more procedurally rigorous frameworks for exactly this kind of trade dispute. There is also an open question about whether the International Trade Commission was required to investigate before these tariffs were proclaimed, a step the statute appears to contemplate, and one nobody can confirm actually happened. If a federal court eventually agrees that Section 338 was functionally retired by later legislation, the same way the Supreme Court struck down the administration's IEEPA tariffs back in February, these 50% duties could be suspended or invalidated entirely. Canada's government has already signaled it intends to pursue exactly that argument in the United States Court of International Trade, alongside a parallel challenge through World Trade Organization dispute mechanisms, where Canada has a real track record, having previously secured binding findings against the United States on dairy trade practices that Washington was ultimately required to acknowledge. That legal cloud matters enormously to how much actual leverage these tariffs carried. A tariff that might get struck down by a court within months is a much weaker negotiating chip than one built on solid statutory ground. And every trade lawyer who has looked closely at Section 338 has flagged exactly this vulnerability. Washington was negotiating from behind a weapon whose legal foundation nobody could fully guarantee would survive contact with a courtroom. It's worth pausing here to give credit to the parts of this dispute Washington deliberately chose not to touch, because the exclusions tell you just as much as the tariffs themselves about where real leverage sits in this relationship. Energy products were excluded from all three Section 338 proclamations. So was potash. So were critical minerals and fish. That is not generosity. That is Washington acknowledging, in the actual text of its own proclamations, exactly which sectors of the Canadian economy the American economy cannot afford to lose access to. Canada supplies roughly 64% of all crude oil imported into the United States, flowing into Midwestern refineries specifically engineered over decades to run on Canadian heavy crude infrastructure that cannot simply be swapped to a different source overnight without billions of dollars in retrofits and years of lead time. The United States imports close to 92% of its potash, the fertilizer input essential to growing corn, wheat, and soybeans at scale, and Canada alone supplies nearly 80% of that. Trump actually floated tariffs on Canadian potash back in late 2025 and walked the idea back within weeks, once agricultural lobbies across the American Midwest made clear how much damage it would cause to domestic farmers. That retreat sits on the public record, and it is the clearest possible proof that whenever Canada holds genuine structural leverage over an input the American economy cannot easily replace, Washington backs away, quietly, without ever calling a press conference to admit it. Compare that to what actually did get hit. Hockey sticks, wine, cement, furniture, clothing, wigs, swimming pools, symbolically loaded, politically visible, and largely replaceable through alternate suppliers, or absorbed by American importers without threatening any part of the broader American economy, the way disrupted energy or fertilizer supply would. That contrast between what Washington was willing to tariff and what it very deliberately carved out is arguably the single clearest piece of evidence in this entire dispute about which side was actually negotiating from structural strength and which side was negotiating from a position built mostly on legal speed rather than genuine economic leverage. Let's put four numbers side by side, because together they explain almost everything about why this pause happened at the 11th hour, rather than the tariffs simply going into effect as scheduled. First, roughly $20 billion in Canadian goods were on the line, against total Canadian exports to the United States of around $382 billion, meaning the headline tariffs covered only about 5% of the overall trading relationship, even as the disruption threat rippled through far more of it. Second, 36 American states count Canada as their single largest export market, meaning senators and governors across more than 2/3 of the country feel pressure from this fight through their own constituents, regardless of party. Third, Canada's own currently active retaliatory measures, the remaining tariffs on American steel, aluminum, and autos left over from last year's broader package, still represent a meaningful chunk of leverage Ottawa never fully gave up, even after removing the bulk of its earlier retaliation back in the fall of 2025. Fourth, and this is the number that arguably mattered most in these final 48 hours, an estimated 13 million American jobs, tied to trade with Canada and Mexico combined, a figure business groups on the American side put directly in front of the White House this week as the tariffs deadline approached. Now, here's the honest complication in all of this, because a fair read of this situation has to include it. A 3-day pause is not a resolution. It is a delay, with a new deadline sitting at the end of the day on Friday, and Carney's own words made clear that important work remains before anything is finalized. Trump has shown a pattern of using deadlines as negotiating theater before, extending timelines, pausing threatened tariffs, and then circling back to renew pressure if he feels the final terms are not favorable enough. This exact playbook has already played out once before with Canada, back in February 2025, when an initial round of threatened tariffs was paused for 30 days after a set of border security commitments, only for the broader dispute to reignite and escalate dramatically over the following year and a half. There is no guarantee this 3-day extension ends any differently. If the documents are not finalized by Friday, or if either side's own internal politics make the current terms unworkable, the 50% tariffs could still land, just a few days later than originally scheduled. There's a piece of history worth sitting with here, because it explains why this specific statute carries so much symbolic weight beyond its legal mechanics. Section 338 was written into the same 1930 legislative package as the broader Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, a law that raised duties on more than 20,000 imported goods to record levels, and is widely credited by economic historians with deepening the Great Depression. Global trade collapsed by roughly 65% between 1929 and 1934, as country after country retaliated against Smoot-Hawley in a cascading spiral nobody could stop once it started. More than 1,000 American economists signed a public petition at the time begging President Hoover not to sign the bill into law. Henry Ford personally spent an evening at the White House trying to talk him out of it. Hoover signed it anyway, and the world spent the better part of a decade dealing with the fallout. When trade historians talk about Section 338 today, they are not just talking about an obscure legal clause. They are talking about a fragment of the single, most cautionary case study in the entire history of American trade policy, dusted off and pointed at the country's own second-largest trading partner nearly a century later. That context alone explains why so many economists and trade lawyers reacted to the July proclamations with more alarm than the dollar figures alone would suggest. Because the last time this exact retaliation logic was allowed to spiral unchecked, it took the better part of a decade and a global depression to unwind. It also explains something else worth noting, which is why so much of official Washington's own business community pushed back quietly rather than loudly. Companies and trade associations that lived through, or at least studied closely, what happened the last time American tariff policy relied on unilateral retaliation logic, tend to treat that history as a warning rather than a playbook. The Chamber of Commerce statement referenced earlier, warning about 13 million American jobs tied to Canadian and Mexican trade, was not an isolated voice. Multiple industry groups representing construction, food manufacturing, and retail sent similar warnings to lawmakers in the weeks leading up to the deadline, each one pointing to the same underlying concern, that a 50% duty stacked on top of existing tariffs does not stay contained to the specific product it targets. It moves through supply chains that cross the Canada-United States border multiple times before a finished good ever reaches a store shelf, and it raises costs at every single crossing. There's also the matter of the broader USMCA relationship still hanging over all of this. On July 1st, 2026, just weeks before the Section 338 proclamations were signed, the United States formally declined to renew the USMCA in its current form during the agreement's mandatory 6-year review. Without that renewal, the three countries now face a cycle of annual reviews that could stretch for up to a decade, with the entire agreement potentially expiring in 2036 if no resolution is reached. Whatever gets finalized in the next few days over Section 338 does not settle that larger question. It may buy goodwill heading into those broader negotiations, or it may simply be one skirmish inside a much longer war over what North American trade looks like for the next decade. There's one more thread worth pulling on before we get to where this actually leaves both countries, because it speaks to how much this entire fight has already reshaped Canada's longer-term thinking, regardless of how these final 72 hours resolve. Even while these tariff negotiations were consuming headlines, Canada spent the past year and a half quietly building trade relationships that have nothing to do with the United States at all. New free trade agreements with Ecuador and the United Arab Emirates, a preliminary trade deal with China that cut tariffs on Canadian canola from roughly 85% down toward 15%, a 20-year liquefied natural gas contract with Germany's Uniper, only the second time in Canadian history that Canadian energy has been contracted to flow somewhere other than North America, a $100 billion port expansion at Roberts Bank in British Columbia, specifically designed to move more Canadian goods to buyers who are not American. None of that infrastructure disappears, regardless of what gets signed by Friday. Every single one of those deals represents leverage. Canada did not have the last time a major tariff dispute with Washington reached a crisis point back in 2018, and it is leverage that grows every year this broader relationship stays this uncertain, giving Ottawa a genuine alternative to simply capitulating on every American demand purely because it lacks other options. That matters enormously for how you should read Carney's own cautious language following this pause. A prime minister with no other economic options negotiates very differently than one who can credibly tell his own public that Canada is building a stronger, more independent economy, regardless of how any single negotiation with Washington concludes. Carney used almost exactly that phrase in his statement following the pause, and it was not an accident. It was a signal aimed as much at domestic audiences questioning why any concessions were necessary at all as it was aimed at Washington. The message underneath the diplomatic language is straightforward. Canada is willing to negotiate seriously, But it is no longer negotiating from a position where the United States is its only meaningful option, and that shift in underlying leverage is arguably the single biggest structural change in this relationship compared to every prior round of the same fight going back nearly a decade. So here is the complete picture as it stands right now, hours after this news broke. Washington reached back 96 years into an obscure Depression-era statute, specifically because its entire legal architecture is built around punishing a country for retaliating against unfair treatment. Canada had already been running that exact playbook against the United States for more than a year before Section 338 was ever signed, using its own tariffs, its own provincial alcohol bans, and its own vehicle surtaxes as a direct, proportional response to tariffs Washington imposed first. When Washington finally formalized its own version of that doctrine into a proclamation, it was explicitly framed by its own trade representative as retaliation against Canada's retaliation, an admission, in plain language, that Canada's countermeasures had already done enough damage to warrant a legal response nearly a century in the making. And when the actual deadline arrived, it was not Canada that folded first. It was the United States that blinked, pausing its own weapon less than 2 hours before it was scheduled to fire, while Canada's own Prime Minister described the resulting arrangement in far more measured terms than the President who announced it. Whether the documents get finalized by Friday, whether the provinces fall in line, whether Canada actually agrees to dismantle the retaliatory tariffs it spent a year and a half building, none of that is settled yet. What is settled is this. The country that built the discrimination offset doctrine into its own trade policy first held its ground long enough to force the country that wrote that doctrine into federal law nearly a century ago to pause its own weapon at the last possible moment. That is not a small outcome. That is the oldest trade instrument in the American legal system getting turned back on the country that dusted it off less than a month after it was signed. And it happened not through a dramatic countermeasure or a headline-grabbing announcement, but through quiet, disciplined patience, a refusal to fold before the clock actually ran out, and a set of countermeasures built years earlier that never fully went away. The next 72 hours will decide whether that outcome holds. Friday's deadline is real. The provincial politics inside Canada are far from settled, and Washington has walked back pauses before only to renew pressure months later. But for right now, in this exact moment, the country that invented the modern doctrine of retaliation for retaliation nearly a century ago just watched its own logic get used against it by the one government that had already been running that same playbook long before Section 338 ever left the archive. If this breakdown helped you actually understand what happened behind last night's headline, share it with someone still confused about why hockey sticks and cement suddenly matter to two national economies. Hit subscribe so you catch the moment those documents actually get signed or this 3-day window collapses instead. And drop a comment below telling me whether you think this deal holds past Friday or whether we're all back here again next week.